Kako, welcome to our first ever virtual Words at Mānoa event. I appreciate all of you for coming during this busy part of the semester. I'm so honored as the Interim Director of Creative Writing Program and on behalf of the Creative Writing Committee to welcome our distinguished visiting writer in residence. I'll introduce him, and please make sure all of you are on mute as well so that there's no background noise. Thank you. Nandi Odhiambo is the winner of the 2018 Elliott Cades Award for Literature, which is the most prestigious literary award here in Hawaii. He's the author of 4 novels: Smells Like Stars, The Reverend's Apprentice, Kipligat's Chants, and Disbanded Nation. He has an MFA in creative writing from the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and a PhD in English right here from the University of Hawaii at Mānoa. Currently, he is an associate professor of English at the University of Hawaii, West Oahu, and his next book is, very excitingly, a work of literary criticism, forthcoming from Lexington Books in 2021. Thank you, Nandi, so much for being our distinguished visiting writer of this semester. We're obviously so sorry that it had to take place during a pandemic, but we are so thankful and grateful for you for taking good care of our students during this very difficult time for them. We really appreciate all that you've done in the classroom and supporting them now over Zoom. The format for today, Nandi will read, I believe, from his book of literary criticism for about 30 to 45 minutes, and then we'll have about 15 minutes to ask questions, and we should be done at around 4 o'clock or so. And so with that, I want to present this lay to Nandi. So, if you can move your head a little bit towards me. Mahalo, we appreciate you so much, and I'm looking forward to this talk today. We can all maybe give some snaps or some claps. Get it going.
Well, thank you, Craig and Shankar. I also want to thank all of the Mānoa faculty who have been very welcoming in my time that I've been at the school, and also the students in the classes that I've been teaching. So thank you very much for that for this experience. It's been an amazing one for me, and I've been able to really do some thinking about writing, which I'm going to talk about today. The section that I'm going to read from initially is from a book that's coming out in the spring in 2021. And it's a book of literary criticism. So I'm going to read for about 20 minutes from what I've been writing. And then I'm going to talk for about 10 minutes and make some connections between my own work and the theory that I'm exploring in the text. So I'll just begin with the reading. On December 25th, 1911, the diaries of in the diaries of Franz Kafka, the author introduces the concept of small literature, kleine Literatur, a literary work by a writer from a small nation, kleine Nation. While he reflects on the relationship between Jewish and Czech national literature in Warsaw in the early 20th century, Prague is part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Kafka belongs to a German-speaking Jewish ethnic community in a city whose official language is German, but which is predominantly Czech-speaking and Catholic. This complicated linguistic landscape informs his entry's refusal of national literature, a dominant tradition that corrects to a standard in its habitual repetition of the familiar. Absent from the grand narrative, Kafka's kleine Literatur signifies the presence of the small nation in a method of writing that uses an interplay of dissent and affirmation to manifest difference in the public sphere. In Kafka Towards a Minor Literature, Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari make an equivalence between Kafka's kleine Literatur and Literatur mineure in introducing the concept of the minor. Both terms include the connotation Minderheit, minority group, as a way to engage, quote, the writing of a minority within a dominant majority. In short, the minor has three basic features. It changes the standard or dominant language. It shows an interrelationship between the personal and the political. And it uses language as a tool to express collective networks of meaning, not singular identities and absolutes. I use the terms the minoritarian and the majoritarian to describe two methods or two possible treatments of the same language. Now, the majoritarian is a type of thought that functions as a truth-bearing authority, and it reproduces the familiar in its use of a standard measure to correct to a norm. In this way, it deploys definitive meanings in narrative text to offer representative examples of proper essential properties and attributes. On the other hand, the minoritarian is a method of thought that puts optional rules in state of continual variation. And in doing so, it brings hidden backgrounds closer to awareness. Now, I'm going to talk about the two methods separately, and I'll start with the majoritarian or the dogmatic image of thought. In Difference and Repetition, Gilles Deleuze contends that when difference is represented in the classical and modern philosophical tradition, its singularity or specificity is secondary to its identification of similarity or dissimilarity in representation. Ultimately, this majoritarian or dogmatic image of thought draws from René Descartes' correspondence theory of truth, whereby a thinking subject with a unified self has innate, clear, and distinct knowledge of phenomena. Thus, the cogito, the I of the I think, is, according to Emmanuel Levinas, the thought of separation. One knows of subjective experience due to this line that separates the self and the other, a movement of egoism that interiorizes the other as the same. Within this framework, coherence is attained by exercising good sense that particularizes common experience into primary definitions that stand in for identity. That is to say, the difference between oneself and a stranger is thought primarily in analogies of sameness in place of singular difference, or by using oppositional terms such as the other, or in making comparisons of resemblance to the self. The stranger's difference is secondary to their containment in identity. So when we encounter difference in the world, the majoritarian habit of thinking, drawn from good and common sense, cancels out their distinctness. It is captured, limited, and subsumed by standard definitions. Hence, difference in itself recedes into the background, and the generalizing word concept, stranger, other, is foregrounded to artificially block the infinite potential of both the word's multiple meanings and its context-dependent uses. As such, the majoritarian objectively represents matters of fact to produce identities that resemble their representation in language. However, generalizations do not produce or facilitate a deeper understanding of the particular case. Instead, they deploy a dogmatic image of thought and confuse a dogmatic image of thought grounded by commonsensical opinions that evaluates, judges, and confuses the thing in itself, or the noumenon, with the appearance of phenomena. So by unfolding the plurality of difference into a word concept, it draws its identity from eponyms for oneness. Everyone knows is the logic it steadfastly maintains, and so it forecloses any genuine encounter with thought in favor of an entangled chain of artificial blockages that hide difference in its environment. And I'm thinking of environment in terms of Umwelt, Husserl's notion of an aroundness, an aroundness that one inhabits that is separate from the larger world. So one's own environment as opposed to the world one is sharing with others. So in this way, the majoritarian embraces the Enlightenment's foundational propositions that thought in itself is good, sincere, and helps us to recognize truth and find solutions to problems. In its literature, it privileges a narrative point of view stabilized by a rational subject using a priori analytical propositions and a posteriori truths of fact established by experience. At its core, the situation or conditions of the subject's truth-bearing statements are representative of, quote, old categories of genres, types, modes, and style. Its natural psychoanalytic, scientific, supernatural, or anecdotal explanations about human existence use eponyms to reinforce the individual as the center of concern. As a result, the majoritarian thinks a recognizable version of the world into being with representational speech. Faithful adherence to its biases constitute a standard that rejects the surplus indifference that doesn't fit its expression. And so, justified by a linear distribution of artificial blockages, it habitually transmits a delirium caused by the erasure of the singular occasion or instance, and as a consequence, it ignores, hides, and corrects this undisclosed difference that lies beyond its limits. Ultimately, this method is an instrument for a correct use of sense. One, quote, that presides over the designation of sounds and over the affectation of images and metaphors. So, satisfied by its claims to tradition, its accumulation of masters, and its sentimental attachment to the solutions it proposes, it sweeps the unfamiliar to the margins with a method steeped in incoherent and contradictory statements about difference. Now, I'm going to switch and talk about the minoritarian, or the thought without an image. So, German philosopher Gustav Frege argues on sense and reference that there are two types of sense: Bedeutung, a primary one whose identity is established by correspondence with the same object, and Sinn, S-I-N-N, a secondary one that refers to difference. In the majoritarian, Bedeutung denotes an individual's point of view within a network of signs using an agreed upon grammar to stabilize meaning within a discourse community. According to Deleuze, its descriptions of difference draw on the language of diversity and multiculturalism to conflate identity with difference. This is something that was an area that I really worked at exploring in my own, in the last novel that I was working on. And so something I'll talk about a little bit later. Hence, officially sanctioned versions of difference are viewed through categories that are stand-ins for similarity and homogeneity. In the minoritarian, or thought without an image, a thing sensed, Sinn, is not a particular identity stabilized by a proper name. Instead, life presents difference in a field of problems without pre-given solutions, and the thought without an image discloses our encounters with beings of the sensible that actualize a virtual process of individuation and becoming. Moods are provoked by forms of life with hidden depth, and our directed attention or concern brings this being of the sensible out of remoteness through what Martin Heidegger describes as deseverance, or, quote, making the farness vanish. As such, the world is disclosed in the minoritarian by personae, not characters, not subjects, by personae that touch the senses with an interactive network of virtual and actual relationships and their expression as effects and events. In addition, the minoritarian reflects the situation and conditions of many immigrants today who live in an environment where the language is not their own. They've traveled from somewhere or are born into situations that are different from previous generations, and this separates them as a minority in the dominant culture where they dwell. So, minoritarian literature is, quote, a materially intense expression of this difference. It enriches a dominant language from within by adding to its lexicon, and it embodies a process of perpetual becoming through variation, not stasis. This expression machine does not represent the speaking subject or embrace standardized themes and symbols to convey its meaning. Instead, both its content and expression are parts of a changing network or assemblage of intense forces. As a result, it does not provide meaning by way of definitive answers to questions, but its significance derives from how it senses sin. As such, the Minoritarian addresses questions produced by concrete and imminent conditions of difference, and it does so by asking, quote, how, where, when, and from what point of view, not questions of essence, but questions of events. Hence, this method of thought discloses the affects of encounters from the perspective of a narrative sense, sin, along with the collective desires they express within assemblages. Thus, it provides the necessary conditions to move beyond the representational in order to enable potential new insights. Such narration in minoritarian literature isn't stabilized by an enunciating subject as a cause, or since in minoritarian literature, it isn't stabilized by an enunciating subject as a cause, or by a subject of a statement as an effect. It's an abstract machine that engages with shifting states from desubjectified perspectives. It sweeps up the subject into its function as a cog in a social machine, and it articulates lines of escape from the limitations of identities. As such, it moves beyond the boundaries of the majoritarian and expresses the excess found outside of its eponyms of oneness, of sameness. Beyond capture, it prioritizes conditions that are, quote, our actual relation to the world, to the body, to desire, and to the economy of life and death. Thus, the minoritarian reveals an encounter between the dominant culture's use of the power over through constants or standards, and its own use of power as a capacity of variation and becoming through innovation. So the thought without an image functions as an expression machine affected by mind-independent pre-individual forces that disrupts the reproduction of the same or constant. As a result, it has a degree of independence from visual reference, and its inextricable link to sociality gives it a double function: to decode the dogmatic image of thought in order to re-encode it with a thought without an image. In the minoritarian, language is a rallying point that Abdelkader Khatibi identifies as a type of bilingual writing practice, one that does so with deviations from standard lexical terms, uses unusual juxtapositions like collocations, and defamiliarized language. It includes unexpected metaphors and unusual syntax and turns of speech. So this radical bilingualism evokes two languages simultaneously, the same and the different. And it achieves multiple meanings while maintaining its monolingual surface. In addition, it explores, quote, the internal tensions of a language by using, quote, intensities or tenses. So these are atypical expressions such as ungrammatical sentences, neologisms, factless propositions that stretch or depart from conventional language use. Thus, quote, language stops being representative in order to now move towards its extremities or its limits. Consequently, it dismantles or decodes and re-territorializes or recodes, and this doubleness of movement breaks ground for new avenues of thought. Now, a comparison between the creolizing impact of Prague German and African American English is instructive to illustrate how minority communities transform the dominant language. Deleuze and Guattari write, quote, Black English has its own grammar, which is not defined by a sum of mistakes or infractions against standard English. It still has the same rules of study that are applied to standard English. So it's not an arbitrary utterance of gibberish, but a language with its own grammatical structure. Its fugitive movement transforms and reconfigures space, and it sets, quote, American English in variation. And incidentally, there's a chapter that I'm working on where I'm exploring Pidgin in Hawaii as another example of how the dominant language has changed from within. As a consequence, the minoritarian does not designate a specific literature, a denotation, an identity. Instead, it's a method. It's a method that affirms a being of the sensible that becomes in the ebb and flow of foregrounded thought in an excluded background reality. And so it reveals an interplay between the unveiling or unconcealment of a superficial foreground, a phenomena, and an unnoticed, unfathomable backdrop. In treating objects and things as deeper than our awareness about them, the minoritarian provides what Deleuze and Guattari describe as, quote, the revolutionary conditions for every literature within the heart of what is called established literature. This line of flight or escape enables what Fred Moten and Stefano Harney describe as a process of moving, quote, into the undercommons of the Enlightenment, where the work gets done, where the work gets subverted. According to the scholars, the undercommons is a type of study and an experiment in a method of thinking outside the majoritarian. It decenters the rational subject as well as their essentialist categories by refusing, quote, the call to order and to refuse to call others to order. This engagement with subterranean thought rejects the subordination of learning to knowledge, and in its unabstracted planning and development reverses compulsions, quote, against the mastery of one's own speed. As a result, it provides a vehicle for an ethical relationship with difference that begins with a fundamental freedom in our encounters with others. In this way, the minoritarian is a fugitive text that senses sin in a collective network and embraces a noumenal freedom in things and others in its movement between surface and depth, foreground and background, that refers to a hidden object's radical, quote, radical non-locatability. Okay. So that essentially is the description of the two methods that I'm thinking about. And when I was working on my fourth novel, Smells Like Stars, one of the things that I was thinking about was just difference and displacement. And I wanted to figure out how I could work with a narrative structure and form and language and characters to adequately tackle the question of difference and to work in some ways to include what is left out. And by that, I was moving away from identity and representation. So the way things are ultimately shown and trying to do it in a completely different way. So what I did is I started by coming up with a series of questions about difference that kept me focused. And they were specifically in the three areas of the minoritarian method. So they had to do with changing the dominant language and showing the interrelationship between the personal and the political, and also exploring how personae and characters related in larger collective networks of meaning. And in the end, I think the main question that I really was attempting to address was something that Levinas talks about: what is a responsible and ethical way to communicate in our encounters with other people? So there was a framework, and at the time of writing, it was very interesting to me. And I have been able in the last couple of months think more deeply about what I was doing. And so I'm just going to talk about a few of the things that I'm going to extract from my rereading of my work. So the main thing was I was thinking about structure, and I wanted to move away from a privileged point of view. So there are 4 characters, and they are all basically given similar amount of time in the text, so there is no privileged point of view. So that's one intervention, the plurality, multiple points of view. And what I was hoping that would emerge as a result of those juxtapositions is through a kind of decipherance where you're bringing things that are in the background closer to attention, is that you could see the limits of singular meanings and how they just are not effective. They don't work in the relationships in the novel. I was also really interested in thinking about social networks or assemblages, and two ways that I do that. Two of the ways that I did that. One is there was a backstory with an election, and so that is that overt kind of connection between the personal and the political, because one of the characters is the daughter of a politician. And so there is a collapsing of the official version of things with how these things play out in people's personal lives. But I also had a character who was a personae, Rita Uzel, who's a celebrity who shows up in the different perspectives in very different ways. She's sort of a social media icon. And so having this figure show up in all these different ways in the novel, I was able to sort of work with the idea of an assemblage or an interconnection in terms of how you made sense of a particular character. There are other things, instability of meaning. There's the majoritarian is working with the absolute. And so one of the things that I wanted to work with is that there is no unifying truth. I don't actually know how I feel about that, because I think that I need in the end to have some security of something that's unifying. However, I'm still kind of exploring this idea of radical doubt, a kind of dissented form of thinking. And so all of the characters inhabit a kind of radical doubt in relation to the conventions in the society that they live in. And it's specifically focused through marriage, to the characters getting married. So you see that played out in the way marriage is represented in the text. Now, in terms of working with internal tensions of language, one of the areas I've been interested in is pacing with my writing. And so that I would like there to be a quality in the actual language that speaks to an intensity of feeling and intensity of experience that is distinct from other sort of everyday experiences. And so one of the ways that I do that, that I integrated that kind of pacing in the book, is just moments of really heightened language, where there is a kind of deviation from standard language, use of unusual juxtapositions. And so I was trying to play around with the monolingual surface and give it added depth. Finally, I should mention language. It's a book where I have 3 different languages, English, German, and Swahili. And it was important to me to retain those languages in the text without translating them. I have a footnote if you are interested in knowing what it means. But part of it is just the way in which language contains within it a whole epistemology. When I grew up in Kenya and moved to Canada, there were things I didn't know what the National Basketball Association was or the National Hockey League was. And so there's a way in which I was outside of a whole experience that was in language, and it's something that I had to learn. So I was really interested in this text, in just trying to figure out ways to maintain the integrity of a language within the text. So those are, oh yes, and finally, the endings. I struggle with conventional endings, with closure. And so without giving anything away, this is just an ending that doesn't have that kind of closure in this book. So I think that's all that I have to say. Thank you for your attention.
Awesome, mahalo. So thank you, Nandi, so much for that very thought-provoking presentation. I really appreciated the way that you wove together the theory that you're engaging with alongside your creative writing as well.